everybody. I'm speaking down from southwest France here. So I know there are people from all around the world, I think, listening in this evening. This is one of the advantages of our current situation, that we are putting on more of these events and we can link people up from around the world. So this evening, we're talking about spiritual emergency and this new book co-edited by Jules Evans, who's here with us. Tim Reed, unfortunately, wasn't able to be with us, but we have Satyin Taylor and Anna Beckmann speaking as well. And just one remark before I hand over to Jules. And it's just not all of you will know about the origins of and then comparison between the terms spiritual emergence and spiritual emergency. And as far as I know, and Jules can correct me, these terms were first used widely by Stan Grof, Stan and Christina Grof in the early 1980s, early 1990s, late 1980s. And I think what's very interesting is this relationship between spiritual emergence and spiritual emergency. And I think we have a little bit of both going on at the moment with the lockdown and the re-emergence into what we're going to find out what kind of normal it's actually going to turn out to be. and I'm sure many of you have read that there are really huge mental health problems and issues and challenges down the line. So this is extremely relevant, and we're very pleased to have you all here. And I'll hand right over to Jules. Thank you, Jules.
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me okay, and that the Wi-Fi works fine for the next 30 minutes while I'm talking. Hi from Bristol. It's a pleasure to be with you all this evening. What's the format of the evening is I'm going to first talk and lay out some of the ideas in this book, Breaking Open, for about 35 minutes. Then we're going to put you into breakout rooms of 4 to discuss a question that I'm going to pose. And then Satyin Taylor and Anna Beckmann, who are 2 of the contributors to this book, are going to talk about their experience and some of their ideas and reflections each. And then we'll open it to Q&A from you. So first of all, I'm going to lay out how we came across this, how I came across this idea and how we came to explore it in this book. Here we go, the slide's not working immediately. There we go, great. So I wrote this book 3 years ago, in which I explored the topic of ecstatic experiences. So this domain of ecstatic experience is on the whole not very much explored by psychology or by psychiatry. On the whole, it's rather ignored. And when psychologists and psychiatrists do talk about this domain of experience, they aren't really sure what to call it. So there are various different types of terminology. You might call it, some people might call it mystical experiences or self-transcendent. Maslow talked about peak experiences. I prefer the term ecstatic experience. You also see altered states of consciousness used as a term. Anthropologists prefer to talk about trance states or possession experiences. In the world of kind of corporate coaching, they prefer to talk about flow states, which is a kind of slightly less wild form of ecstatic experience, spirit possession. And then psychiatrists might pathologize some of these experiences and talk more in terms of psychosis or schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. So these all are kind of exploring an overlapping domain of human experience. Now, in my book, The Art of Losing Control, I use the term ecstasy. I prefer the term ecstatic experience, which comes from the ancient Greek ekstasis, which literally means standing outside. An ecstatic experience is a moment when you stand outside your ordinary sense of self and something powerful goes into you, feel a deep connection to something greater than you. And that experience can be both euphoric or, conventionally we think of ecstatic as meaning very happy. That kind of experience can be euphoric, but it can also be terrifying. You're losing control and surrendering to something much more powerful than you. An ecstatic experience can happen alone or with others. You can have a collective ecstatic experience. And it can be interpreted in many different ways. An ecstatic experience can be interpreted as a connection to God, to universal consciousness, to a spirit or a demon, to nature, to aliens, to another person or group of people, to a nation, or to your own higher self. In other words, people interpret ecstatic experiences not just as supernatural or theistic experiences. Now, most cultures around the world, at most times in history, have used ecstatic rituals for healing and catharsis, for meaning, to connect to other beings, and for fun. It's boring often to be stuck in one's head and in one's ordinary ego. And it's fun to get out of our heads. That's why humans and other animals like to take intoxicants to get out of our heads. As Aldous Huxley put it, humans have a basic urge to self-transcendence. However, in Western culture, there's been a centuries-long ideological war over the nature of mystical or ecstatic experiences. So since at least the 17th century, materialist philosophers, psychologists, and psychiatrists have defined ecstasy or religious experiences as a form of mental illness. So this is a photo of a patient at a French asylum in the late 19th century. She was a patient of Jean-Martin Charcot, who was a pioneering neurologist. And Charcot, along with many other early psychiatrists, he said that ecstasy is a symptom of a brain pathology called hysteria. And he took these photos of his patients in these ecstatic poses and to kind of prove that, you know, look, it's just like Joan of Arc, say, or just like St. Teresa. And Charcot said that all the great ecstatics of yesteryear, from Socrates to Muhammad, were really suffering from brain disorders, were really suffering from hysteria. This was part of an ideological war between secular science and the church over who got authority about who got to say what was and how to heal the soul. So part of that ideology define ecstatic experience as mental illness. So if you have a missense in materialist psychology or psychiatry, it's proof that you are degenerate, that you are mad, unfit for society, or at best just stupid, and that you deserve to be medicated and perhaps locked up. Because of that pathologizing of ecstatic experience, we have learned that if you have a spiritual experience in our culture, you keep quiet about it because you don't want to look degenerate and be locked up. Now, on the other hand, at the margins of Western culture, you have these subcultures like ecstatic Christianity and the New Age, which have tried to find a kind of more valid and positive interpretation for ecstatic experiences. And they, in kind of direct conflict with the materialist pathologization of ecstasy, say that no, ecstasy is not pathologized. It's actually the best thing that could possibly happen to you. It's the supreme experience of human existence to have one of these experiences. And if you have an ecstatic experience, it's proof that you are elect, that you are chosen by God, that you are superior to the rest of humanity in your maturity and realization. And it's proof that you're at the vanguard of spiritual evolution. In other words, it's extremely good if you have one of these kinds of experiences. So what you've tended to have in our culture is a dichotomy, a kind of black and white dichotomy where ecstatic experiences are either wholly bad and pathological, or they're entirely good and wonderful. Is there the possibility of a middle ground where ecstatic experiences can be wonderful and inspiring and give you meaning and flourishing, but they can also be difficult and messy and somewhat pathological sometimes as well? So that's what I was interested in, whether there's a middle ground between this kind of dichotomized views. There have been some psychologists and thinkers who've tried to find a more nuanced view of ecstatic or mystical experiences. Like, for example, William James, the great philosopher and psychologist and the author of The Varieties of Religious Experience, and his friend and colleague, Frederick Myers, who was the co-founder of the Society for Psychical Research. They came up with a model for explaining ecstatic experiences. So Myers was the first psychologist to really put forward a theory of the subliminal self, before Freud, before Jung. In about 1892, he wrote the first paper about the subliminal mind. And these two, really, James and Myers, are the founders of what's called transpersonal psychology, which is a school of psychology that tries to find a positive place for spiritual experiences rather than just pathologizing them. So this is the model of the psyche that James and Myers put forward. We have our ordinary, everyday conscious ego, which is a useful construction that we've evolved to deal with the demands of everyday life. But our psyche is actually a lot bigger than that. There's this, below the threshold of consciousness, there's this much larger subliminal self. And James and Myers said that in that subliminal self, there is both good things and bad things. In Myers' words, it's both a rubbish dump, so there's kind of primitive, backward, illogical aspects to it, and it's a treasure trove. So Myers said that there were latent potentialities down there in the subliminal mind. And they said that when you have an ecstatic experience, you are opening to that subliminal self beyond your ordinary ego construction. And James and Myers said, perhaps we connect to the divine through our subliminal self. So we go into kind of trance states or altered states of consciousness. And perhaps in that more open, altered state of mind, we can connect to other realities and perhaps to the divine. So according to this model of ecstasy, an ecstatic experience is what Myers called an uprush from the subliminal mind, a sudden release of normally latent or repressed energy, a flooding out of archetypal mythical material, and it creates the possibility for reconfiguration. Your normal, ordinary habits of ego dissolve in the kind of hot molten lava of the ecstatic experience. And there's a window of fluidity where you can choose a different kind of habitual ego. So in some sense, it's very positive and healing. But it can also mean the release of shadow material, things like repressed trauma, for example. And when you're in one of these ecstatic experiences, your ordinary critical thinking faculties, your rationality is somewhat suspended. So that can be quite dangerous. So it's both potentially very good for you, healing. You can get inspired, you can get incredibly creative, you can be healed, connected to others, but it's also potentially quite risky as well, this explosion of energy. So Myers and James suggested that geniuses are people with unusually open access to their subliminal mind. So someone like, that explains the eccentric genius figure like John Nash. They have access to inspirations for their subliminal mind. But that openness, that porousness to their subliminal self also makes them prone to illogical thinking or delusions or sometimes psychosis. Now, what we've seen since the 60s is having rather marginalized ecstatic experiences, there was a sudden explosion of ecstasy back into Western culture through ecstatic practices like Eastern meditation, psychedelics, and rock and roll. So there was a sudden hunger for ecstatic experiences in mass culture. And you can see this in statistics. You can see that according to poll data, a growing number of people have said they've had one or more mystical experience. So in 1962, only 20% of people said they'd had a mystical experience. By 10 years ago, almost 50% of people said they'd had one or more mystical experience. In the last, that figure is probably higher now, thanks to the psychedelic renaissance. So now at least 30 million people in America say they've taken psychedelics. They've become much more mainstream. So I imagine the number of people who've had one or more mystical experience is now over 50% and rising. But my question is, what if people are having mystical experiences that they're not prepared for? What if, in previous cultures, you have a mystical experience and it's very much part of your culture. There are rituals for it. There's training for it. There are elders to guide you. You might well be in a religious community and your life is devoted to the mystical path. But in our culture, you might be just an ordinary person who happens to take psychedelics one weekend, and you suddenly and unexpectedly have a full-blown mystical experience. You go totally beyond your ordinary ego. And you weren't expecting this, and you weren't trained for this. And then you have to go back to your ordinary life, your ordinary job, your conventional habitual identity on Monday morning. And that could be extremely scary and difficult and disorientating. In other words, sometimes mystical experiences can be quite messy. So we've been sold the idea that spiritual experiences are always totally wonderful and light and happy, when actually they can be really quite frightening if you're not prepared to go beyond your habitual ego. So some psychologists have looked at this kind of messy spiritual experience and the closeness of mystical experience to psychosis. Joseph Campbell said, "The psychotic drowns in the same waters in which the mystic swims with delight." So one of the first papers on messy spiritual experiences was by Roberto Assagioli, who was the founder of psychosynthesis. And he wrote, "The incidence of disturbances having a spiritual origin is rapidly increasing nowadays in step with the growing number of people who consciously or unconsciously are groping their way to a fuller life." But it was only quite recently, only in 1989, that the term spiritual emergency was introduced in this collection of essays, which was edited by Christina Groth and her husband Stanislav Groth. And they brought together papers by people like R.D. Lang and Ram Dass, and they coined the term spiritual emergency. They wrote in their introductory essay, "Many individuals experiencing episodes of non-ordinary states of consciousness, accompanied by various emotional, perceptual, and psychosomatic manifestations, are undergoing an evolutionary crisis rather than suffering from a mental disease." So they tried to kind of bracket spiritual emergency from ordinary kinds of mental illness. They wrote, "If properly understood and treated as difficult stages in a natural developmental process, these experiences, these spiritual emergencies or transpersonal crises, can result in emotional and psychosomatic healing, in creative problem solving, in personality transformation and consciousness evolution." So they were arguing that if navigated properly, these kinds of emergencies can be transitions to greater wholeness and healing. So in the book, The Art of Losing Control, I wrote a little bit about spiritual emergencies in passing, but I didn't go into them that deeply. But then I suppose I had my own kind of spiritual emergency after the book came out. I'd become interested in psychedelics while writing the book, but I didn't want to do psychedelics myself before the book came out, and I did all the publicity for it, in case I had a kind of messy trip and then had to do all the book publicity whilst coping with all of that. So I waited until the book came out, and then afterwards I went to the Amazon to a ayahuasca retreat. Ayahuasca is a kind of psychedelic potion that's been drunk by Amazon Indians for hundreds of years. So I went to an ayahuasca retreat and drank the ayahuasca potion there over 10 days, 5 different ceremonies. And the retreat was absolutely kind of fascinating. And I enjoyed it very much. But then I went into quite a dissociated state after the retreat. So about 2 days afterwards, when I wasn't on the psychedelic anymore, whilst I was traveling in Latin America on my own, I've ended up in this very dissociated state where I thought I was either in some kind of alternate reality, where I was either in a dream of my own making, or I was in some kind of afterlife or limbo. I was sure that I wasn't in normal reality. And a friend was texting me while I was out there, and luckily she was quite familiar with spiritual emergencies. She's actually one of the contributors to the book we wrote. And she said, I think you should come home. And I followed her advice. So I then had to take 3 flights back to London, all the time thinking I was in a dream or in the afterlife, but I was pretty sure it was in a dream. Because I thought I was in a dream, I upgraded to first class on the plane back from Latin America, and sadly got the credit card bill a month later, proving that it wasn't a dream. So I finally landed in the airport in London and saw my friend there. And it was a bit like the last scene in Inception, where he arrives in the airport and sees his family, and he's still not sure if he's in a dream or not. And a bit like the hero of that film, I decided I'm not entirely sure, but I'm going to go with it anyway. And actually, as soon as I was with my friends, I started to kind of come down and reconnect with this reality. As soon as my friends kind of gave me love and hugs, I just kind of came back down. But it took a while. It took a few days where I still suddenly not be sure that what the reality I was in was real. So after a few weeks, I was totally back down in this reality, but I was fascinated by this experience I'd been through. One thing I noticed, by the way, was that wisdom still worked in these very altered states. So I couldn't really understand books or films when I was in this very dissociated state. I first of all tried to read the book Dune, and I couldn't make head or tails of that. So then I tried to read Asterix, and I couldn't understand that either. But I read this book by a Tibetan Buddhist nun, Pema Chodron, and that was crystal clear to me. I totally understood the wisdom in that. So I noticed that wisdom still worked in these very altered kind of states. So I then organized with an event where 4 people spoke about their spiritual emergencies, including Tim Reed, who's a psychiatrist with he's very rare in that he's a psychiatrist who's very open to spiritual experiences as well, though there are others. Anna was also one of the speakers at that event. And after that event, which went very well, we thought maybe we should put a book together of people's accounts of their spiritual emergencies. And of course, the aim of the book was not to say what these experiences definitely meant or what they definitely pointed to in terms of metaphysics or the existence of God or anything like that. So really the book is agnostic on those kinds of questions. Instead, we asked our authors to say, what do they think caused the event or the emergency? What was it like? And what helped them? So all of our contributors were people who'd gone through this experience and come out the other side. So first of all, what caused their emergencies? Now, there's certain possibilities that we didn't really look into. There may be genetic factors that predispose people to altered states. You notice in shamanic cultures, for example, that the shamanic gift or capacity or sickness, creative illness perhaps, is inherited. It goes through families. So perhaps there's a genetic factor that predisposes people to be more open to spiritual experiences. Perhaps schizotypy might be an inherited personality characteristic. Schizotypy is a theoretical concept that posits a continuum of personality characteristics and experiences throughout the whole population, ranging from normal dissociative or imaginative states like being prone to daydreaming to extreme states of mind related to psychosis or schizophrenia. Schizotypy, I mean, there might be positive and benign forms of schizotypy, which make you very prone to creativity, but might also make you prone to difficult or extreme experiences. In terms of our contributors, we noticed that of our 14 contributors, 10 of them had early trauma in childhood or in their teens. And so that may have predisposed them to spiritual emergencies. They go beyond their ordinary ego, and perhaps trauma that had been somewhat buried then kind of comes out in their mystical experience. There were also short-term triggers as well, psychedelic drugs for 2 of us, intense spiritual exercises, for example, being on a meditation retreat, loss of a significant other, being bereaved or having a bad breakup. Travel, we noticed quite often these kinds of emergencies happened when people were away from their normal support network, which is often, the people you know and love ground you in this reality and help you to reality check and to regulate your emotions as well. And in one instance, a political crisis was the trigger for the spiritual emergency. One of our authors had a kind of psychotic episode following Brexit, and there have been other cases of that. And I know of cases now where spiritual emergencies have been triggered by the pandemic. So I'll talk about that a bit at the end of my talk. There may also have been supernatural causes as well. I mean, psychology thinks of these as experiences in an individual's mind, but they could also be thought of as encounters with a greater reality, perhaps with greater intent. So again, we as the editors remained agnostic about that, but certainly some of our contributors thought about their experience in that way. So what was it like? Well, there's a build-up of tension in the person and then a flip into another state of consciousness in which time slows down and the person's attention is deeply absorbed in the moment. Things can take on a heightened, a numinous significance. There can be an overlap of the inner and outer world. Dream, archetypal and mythical material spills out into waking consciousness. The person might feel they notice synchronicities, signs, patterns, uncanny coincidences, songs on the radio, maybe billboards in the street, sudden encounters with people they've just been thinking about. So for some people, it feels quite paranormal. The person may see themselves as cosmic archetypes as well. So some of our contributors saw themselves as perhaps as Jesus or Eve or Ishtar, these kinds of divine archetypes. And there can be a possession by these kinds of mythical archetypes. In other words, there's not much critical distance between this mythical material flooding out of the subconscious. There's often a feeling of unreality, of death, of a end time. So certainly that's what it felt like for me. I thought, have I died and am I in the afterlife? And I was some of the contributors talking about similar kinds of thoughts. Am I in limbo? There can be a feeling of ontological uncertainty. You're not sure what reality you're in. Am I constructing this? If I'm constructing this, does that mean it's my dream or am I God? So it's a bit like The Truman Show, which I don't know if you've seen that film, but that's quite a good exploration of the kind of psychotic experience, thinking that maybe everyone around you is an actor or somehow not real. So John Weir Perry, who ran a recovery center for people who suffered from psychosis in the 70s, he said, whenever a profound experience of change is about to take place, its harbinger is the motive of death. In severe visionary states, one may feel one has crossed over into the realm of death and is living among the spirits of the deceased. That's definitely what it was like for me. When I was on a ferry in Latin America, I thought I was on Charon's boat crossing the Styx. So this is one of our contributors, Deborah Martin, who took MDMA at a club in Glasgow, had a very weird trip, and then woke up and was still in an altered state. She writes, the morning after the club, I woke to a world that looked entirely different. Everything in the room, the clothes, the walls, the chest of drawers, seemed strangely insubstantial, as if woven from air. Otherness, the otherness of objects, the otherness of people, was just an illusion, yet I wanted those illusions back. I was tortured by the fear that this perceptual shift was going to result in the entire world disappearing before my eyes. So Deborah had a sudden, unexpected and involuntary mystical experience of interconnectedness, of going beyond the illusion of separateness. But she didn't want that. She wasn't prepared for it. She wasn't seeking it. And she didn't know how to kind of go back into ordinary reality. She was only, I think, about 22 at the time. So in some ways, spiritual emergencies can give us an insight which perhaps we might still accept as valid after the experience. So neuroscientists like Anil Seth, for example, talk about how our experience of reality is a controlled hallucination, a set of habitual expectations based around a fictional hero, i.e. the ordinary ego. And in kind of mystical experience and spiritual emergency, you can see through those habitual expectations and see that you're constructing it, but you can interpret that wrong. And rather than seeing that we live in a consensual hallucination, a collective hallucination, you can think, this is all just my hallucination and I'm the only person who's real. You can interpret it in the wrong way. So there can be this powerful sense of interconnectedness to the universe that clearly Deborah experienced, which can be both euphoric and ego-inflating, I am God, or terrifying and paranoid, to get me. So if you think you're the Messiah, it can be, you can suddenly switch from that into feeling persecuted and hunted down. So the raw self is stripped of its usual armor, and it feels acutely sensitive and isolated and alienated sometimes from others. A lot of our contributors talked about strained relationships or breakups or bruising encounters with experts, whether that's health experts or religious experts, who offered glib and reductionist explanations of their experience. So what helped people through this experience? Well, Tim and I tried to group together what our contributors said helped under three headings, which we kind of took from psychedelic therapy, the idea of setting and integration. So first of all, setting. A sympathetic, calm, non-judgmental setting helps the mind and body slow down and stabilize. So when I was back in London, staying with friends, and they weren't freaked out by me being in this very altered state, or if they were, they didn't show it to me, and they just gave me kind of love and support, and that helped me just settle down and slow my mind from its whirring around. Human connection, love, and touch helps bring the mind back from its flight to transcendence. I hope my internet's going okay. So that's something that Anna wrote about in her, she talks about in her chapter, that just being grounded through love and through hugs helps us settle down back into this kind of group reality. And then maps and guides can help us find a way back as well. That could be books, that could be therapists or friends. I started to see a therapist after that experience who was trained in psychedelic integration, and I'm still seeing her 2 years later, and she's helped kind of guide me since that experience. And also tranquilizers may help take the edge off when you're in this very heightened nervous state. They can be helpful in the short term. And unfortunately, psychiatric wards are not always the best setting for someone in this very heightened state. The mindset that helps people, above all, our contributors manage to find a positive frame of meaning and growth, rather than just the frame of breakdown and illness. So it made me think of the quote by the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, what disturbs people is not events, but their opinion about events. So it's not the weird experiences that are happening to you that actually causes you disturbance, it's your opinion about it. And if your frame is, this is terrifying, frightening, pathological, and deadly, that's going to freak your mind out even more. So mindfulness practice, many of our contributors say that breathing exercises or connecting to the body or things like Tai Chi, that helps them to connect, to slow themselves down, to slow their emotions down and connect to this material reality. An attitude of acceptance as well. For me, just saying to myself, this will pass, was extremely helpful. There were times I couldn't understand conversations. I wondered, is my ability to understand other people going to come back? And I just say to myself, this will pass, and it did. and self-compassion as well. I mean, it's a real test. You're a real mess, and your ordinary ego, which you've put so much pride and joy into, is not working. So you really have to practice compassion for yourself. And humility is also very helpful to avoid ego inflation, to avoid what Ram Dass calls the trap of specialness, and to try to attain the kind of what Alan Watts calls no fuss spirituality. Yes, you might be having these unusual experiences, and they're remarkable and beautiful, but in some ways they're no big deal. Lots of people have experiences like that. Just because you're having a kind of encounter with the divine within you doesn't mean you're God or the Messiah. And discernment, trying to practice discernment even in these very liminal states. Am I taking a dream metaphor over literally? You may have the experience of the apocalypse, but you could interpret that over literally as the literal end of the world. So it's of course very difficult. I mean, I couldn't really reality check when I was in my spiritual emergency, but we can try gradually to practice some discernment. Integration, I won't talk about that now, but basically it takes a while to integrate one of these experiences. It takes months and years, but all of our contributors have, and they've managed to have fulfilling lives and to learn from these experiences they went through. And many of them are working in the kind of as healers in some capacity or other, and they're drawing on that experience to try and help and heal others. So just finally, I mean, there are many questions, I think, that are left to be answered, which we just began to look at in this study. I wonder, is spiritual emergency the right phrase? Terminology is so tricky in this area. The Groffs try to draw a clean line between spiritual emergency and other mental illnesses, like ordinary psychosis. But I wonder if there is a risk of doing that, whether, or at least whether one can draw a clean line between ordinary psychosis and spiritual emergencies. I think there is a risk in transpersonal psychology of elitism, going back over 100 years of transpersonal psychology, where basically you're saying, we, the special educated, higher consciousness white people, have spiritual emergencies, but you, the masses, have dangerous mental disorders and should be medicated and locked up. So there's a risk of bracketing spiritual emergencies just for the elite. So if you're an elite person, you have a spiritual emergency, but everyone else just has messy old psychosis. And I see that trend in transpersonal psychology, a trend to kind of elitism in a way. I don't think one needs to necessarily draw that clean line between spiritual emergencies and psychosis. The same things work for psychotic experiences as for spiritual emergencies. Things like kindness, connection, patience, mindfulness, helping people to find meanings for their experience. And I'm interested in frameworks like the Anoixis framework, which is from a group in the Netherlands, which tries to help people to navigate psychosis by asking similar questions as we asked our contributors. What is experience? What meaning did you make from it? What triggers were present? What is needed to help you through this experience, rather than avoiding just pathologizing labels? Another issue is we put out a call for an invitation for contributors. Everyone who responded to that was white and educated. So, which, the net did not get very wide, in other words. So I'm interested in how other cultures around the world, other classes and groups might talk about this kind of experience and navigate it. And finally, how is it connected to historical and political circumstances? We can think of the present as somewhat like a collective spiritual emergency, a meltdown of the habitual, the uprush of the repressed, a space, a possibility for reconfiguration, dramatic reconfigurations, a moment of intense species connection. Can we accept ambiguity that it's not clear at the moment what will emerge, but we can try and stay grounded and contribute positively and mindfully while accepting our difficult emotions and the limit of our control. Can we accept that difficult situations like the lockdown, like the pandemic, can be both painful and beautiful? They don't have to be just one or the other. So what we're going to do now is Andrew is going to put you into breakout groups. And these are a suggestion for what you could discuss in your groups. There will be groups of about 4 of you. Have you or people you know had messy spiritual experiences? And if so, what helped? You can talk about that if you want to, but don't feel the imperative if you don't want to. If we're in a collective spiritual emergency at the moment, what attitudes or practices have helped you to cope during the lockdown? One of our contributors is going to speak now. Anna Beckmann is going to speak first, and then Satyin. Anna is a psychotherapist and a filmmaker, and she lives not far from me in Frome. I think I pronounced it right. Was it Frome?
Frome.
Frome, yeah. And she wrote a very beautiful chapter about her experience with some great insights that we really drew on for our concluding chapter as well. So Anna, over to you.
Thank you. As Jules said, it's also for me, it's a real pleasure to be here. And I think I'll just tell you first about my experience when I was 18. So I actually had my spiritual emergency or psychosis very young. And as Jules said, it's difficult to say which of those 2 words really describe it, because both describe it perfectly and also leave out a whole lot. And so I think there's something about maybe looking at finding maybe a new word, or I don't know the answer to that, but I definitely agree that there's maybe a need to look at it from a different perspective. And what I experienced was really a total rupture of my emotional, mental, and spiritual state, and it was terrifying. And I hadn't had much life experience, so my ego wasn't very well. I think it was quite fragile and quite rigid, and so that's the combination that I think means that you're really primed for this sort of experience to be terrifying rather than something that you can really handle and ride the waves of. I was working in Paris as a waitress, and I hadn't really had plans for the future. I just intended to sort of drift through my life and just things would figure themselves out. And I had really built myself a very false sense of self. So I was very confident, and I was very resilient, felt very resilient, and I could do whatever I wanted, and sort of was quite a big risk taker, and was very cut off from the more sensitive just the more sensitive aspects of myself. And I was doing really long shifts at this bar, and I was working very long hours, and I wasn't sleeping, and I was drinking a lot, and I was taking sort of a kind of mild version of speed. And I started to realize that as each morning I woke up, I was feeling very raw and very just too raw in the world. And suddenly the world started to take on quite a lot of symbolic meaning. So for example, a necklace I was wearing felt like it carried a lot of negative symbolism. So I burnt that, and I started burning furniture that I owned, because it somehow the world became very symbolic for me, the external world. And I think Jules talked about this. It was almost as though my unconscious was kind of bleeding out into the world. And that's how I began to deal with it. And I got so sort of anxious and kind of close to terror that I decided I needed to leave. And I bought the cheapest ticket to anywhere, which happened to be New York, because 9/11 had just happened. And so $99 later, I was in New York, and just continued to sort of live in this rather manic state of just very heightened, I guess, a heightened vibration of really needing a lot of stimulus and not really being able to slow down or sleep very much at all. And I remember very clearly standing at the ruins of the Twin Towers and seeing there was still smoke coming up, and there was, it was it happened only a couple of weeks before, so it was all very still in the air there. And when I think about that now, I think about how I was actually looking at my my internal landscape that was about to come, because something similar was about to happen to me and was beginning to happen. And I took a bus I then couldn't stay in New York because I needed to keep running. So I took a bus to Canada, where a good friend of mine lived. And I stayed with her for a while, and I just started to have hallucinations. So I could hear her saying things that she definitely told me to this day, and then she wasn't saying. And I began to, mostly auditory at this point, hallucinations. I couldn't figure out how to, suddenly reality wasn't just symbolic anymore. It was a totally separate thing that I didn't know how to sort of interact with. So even opening a door was really complicated and I didn't know how to tell people. I didn't know how to say, I don't know how to open a door handle, because that would feel very exposing and scary. And what would you do? What would someone do? So I just sort of pretended everything was okay, and inwardly I was really falling apart. And so again, I left her because I felt like she was seeing too much of what was really going on for me. I went back to New York, and at this point I hadn't really slept, at all really for days and days. And I was outside my friend's flat and she wasn't there. And I remember thinking, I had a very clear moment. I was like, I need to go and institutionalize myself. I need to go and hand myself over. And then I thought, but how do I do that? I don't know how to begin to do that. I'm 18, I'm in New York. And then I just sort of fell back into hallucinating. And, I stood in the middle of the road because I didn't realize that cars were dangerous. And I kept hearing people calling my name, and just things were really sort of falling apart. And luckily the man in the deli who owned the deli, he was friends with them, so he let me in. He had the keys to their place, and I lay there and sort of just felt myself fall apart in a way that was, as Jules explained, like quite an ecstatic experience, but very terrifying. So I no longer was me. I was part of the universe. I was part of every single atom that exists. I could hear God's voice, and I felt also that I was God. And I was everything. And it was extremely terrifying and also awesome. My father, who had died when I was 15, his voice was also present. And there was also a connection to Jesus. I was brought up quite a strict Catholic, so there was a Jesus figure who was actually far more gentle and kind than the Jesus I had been brought up with. So that was the positive aspect. But it was mostly really terrifying because I was just not in myself at all in any way. I think I was there for about 4 hours, and my friend's sister came in finally and carried me upstairs. And then I got a plane ticket back to Kenya, which is where I was born, where I'm from. And I thought, when I get back there, my mom and my best friend will realize that something's wrong. And they didn't. I mean, they said, you're acting weird, but no one said, are you okay? What do you need? And so I just kept up this false sense that everything was okay. But I didn't even know how to speak to my mom. I didn't know how to take a shower. I was really struggling day to day, and I just kept copying what people were doing and trying to keep and then also I needed to kind of keep in quite a manic state, because that helped me to get through the day. Again, I was struggling to sleep. So although I was blasted to a really richer understanding of the world and my connection to it, I was totally ungrounded. And Jules mentioned maps. I had no maps, I had no references, nothing that ever described that this thing could possibly happen. I hadn't read enough at that point about madness. So I started to read about madness, and that really helped me to feel like, okay, this is other people who've been through something like this. I started to read about other perspectives and altered states, and that began to help me to feel less isolated. And also I realized that talking to strangers really helped. For some reason I could connect more to them, and sometimes feel like that their words mirrored myself back to me in a way that felt really helpful. But my intimate circle felt very terrifying, in fact. And I really felt so much terror, and I needed to kind of constantly be doing something. And about a year later, I ended up at Melbourne University studying creative arts, which was a really great decision, because I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed that bachelor's very much, but I was still in this constant manic state, and I was taking drugs and I was drinking a lot, and I was sort of chasing this feeling of oneness that I had experienced and would experience. So there was a sense of elation, and it was only then that I really felt like, this is what it means to be alive. This is what it means to be connected. At 2 points during those years, I went to see a psychologist or counselor, and both times they said to me, you've got bipolar disorder, and looked quite terrified at the energy I was bringing. And both times I just thought I sort of understood where they were coming from, but I also knew that there was something deeper, and I really didn't want to be medicalized, and I really didn't want to be sort of put in that category. And so it helped me to begin to read more about it and to understand that I had those processes, but I really didn't want to get caught up in that. And actually, in some ways, I'm really glad, and in some ways, I feel like I maybe would have got some support that I needed, and maybe some medication maybe would have helped me just to regulate the extremes that I was going through. Yeah, and actually, even today, I wouldn't say I have bipolar disorder, but I definitely have bipolar processes. And it's something that I can actually enjoy because I've learned how to witness these states, and I've learned how to ride them with a sense of kind of stepping back and not having to sort of fully immerse myself in them, which has been a real journey. Instead of continuing to do a master's in film, which is what I wanted to do, I then decided to study transpersonal counseling. And Jules also mentioned that type of psychology, which looks at these types of experiences from a spiritual and quite a positive perspective. And it was really great because I finally began to understand things in a different way. Sort of my psychosis was now a spiritual emergency, but the problem was that it was still very much a dissociating from my body, and it was still very much just chasing transcendence and doing shamanic trances and dances and basically just constantly trying to be in an ecstatic place. And it was only until there was a module on the body, the sort of energy centers and the chakras of the body, that my friend Ben guided me and just gently said, what's it like if you really just stay with your base chakra, which is based around your spine? And I remember feeling really scared and feeling that, and then feeling lots of terror and dizziness. And when I opened my eyes, I was really dizzy and I had to get up and vomit. And then I thought, okay, something's going on. I've been neglecting my body. There's so much healing that needs to happen here. So I began to move away from sort of looking at the world purely through a spiritual lens and began to look at my body and realize that it was, of course, also part of this spirituality and it's part of this the spiritual context. There was also another module in that time, which is the Gestalt module, which Gestalt is a type of psychotherapy. And it really helped me to build a kind of philosophy and theory around connecting to the body and finding truth. And so it was really great. I started to read a lot about Gestalt therapy and then eventually moved to London and did my master's in Gestalt psychotherapy. Before that, however, I got diagnosed with an autoimmune disease. And, if I had more time, I'd sort of go into how that's connected to this whole emotional and spiritual experience. However, just to say that, interestingly, Jules talks about hysteria, and actually Graves' disease is what I have. It's a thyroid condition. And back in the late 1800s, when people were, it's often women that get it, when people were diagnosed with Graves, they were told they were basically hysterics, until someone noticed, they also have these other symptoms. So it's kind of interesting. And actually there's been quite a few studies that show the correlation between autoimmune disease and psychosis. And so I really think that the body, obviously, that just shows there's more evidence of the body-mind connection and how one impacts the other. Also, the thing with Gestalt therapy is that it's about creativity and also being creative in the sessions and allowing that, honoring that part as a healing part of ourselves. So I really felt there was a lot in Gestalt therapy that could help me, and so I really enjoyed my studies, and there was a lot of healing during those years. As Jules was talking about linking to the wider field and like political situations, it's really interesting that it's only since about 10 years after I had this episode that I really linked it to 9/11 and to the wider field. Because obviously I was linking it back to my family and to my personal experiences, but then also thinking that there was something about the world at that time that felt faster and disconnected, and in the trauma of 9/11. And I think, these experiences are an expression of that, and we're all an expression of our culture to some extent. So this was an expression of our culture, and it really helps me now when I'm going through difficult periods to look at what's going on around me on a wider field as well. And I think, as Jules was saying, with COVID, with the corona, I've had a lot of clients who are experiencing sort of psychosis or spiritual emergence awakenings, and really in terms of just the parallels, you know, whether it's a kind of infestation of viruses that they can't get away from, or whether it's to do with being watched because, you know, the government has actually implanted this virus in us, or whatever it might be. There's such a kind of direct link often to what's happening on a wider field. I think also, as I mentioned before, when our egos are kind of quite thin and quite fragile and rigid, then these impacts of the wider field can really penetrate us in ways that can be sort of quite devastating. And the rush of the authentic self coming out can actually be really jumbled and scrambled and painful. So there's something about, I've been working on in these last years, sort of 18 years actually, working on actually building a stronger ego, but one that's more fluid. So having a stronger sense of myself, but also a sense of myself that is more fluid and more adaptable. I think what I wanted to speak about was isolation, and how for me it really feels like it's at the root of so much of these sorts of the negative aspects of these sorts of experiences. And when I talk about isolation, I mean isolation from our bodies, I mean isolation from our families, from our communities, and from nature. Those are the four main things. And I think one perpetuates the other. And these can happen in a variety of different ways. But using myself as an example, I grew up quite hypervigilant because my family was unpredictable. So there was a lot of love and warmth, but there was also violence, and there was also just unpredictability that I had to constantly navigate. And so the way I did that was by learning that the outside of the environment was more important than what was happening inside me. And so I began to constantly look out for signs, look out for signals, and then in that way sort of leave my body. And also the culture in my family was very much one of, you know, everything is fine, you know, nothing is ever wrong. And so those two things are not a good cocktail, because then when things are wrong and when you do need to focus on yourself, you don't have the capacity to do that. And I think quite a few people grow up in hypervigilant families. So that was one thing that started my disconnection from myself and therefore from other people. And I really think the healing part for everyone who have experienced something like this is reconnecting back to our bodies, back to our friendships, back to our communities, back to nature. And I know that this can be a really painful thing, because connecting with reality as it is actually can be very painful. Whereas escaping to, whether it's through drugs or maybe spiritual bypassing or through keeping constantly very, very busy, we're moving away from the pain, often as pain. And actually it's by working through the pain and the fear of rejection or whatever might be there that is such a huge part of the healing journey. And as Jules mentioned, hugging, like lots of physical contact. One thing I learned from my illness was that I really needed to take care of my body, and that I hadn't done that, you know, forever really. And so for me, what's been really important is body work. So acupuncture, I see various types of body therapists. I have a massage when I can. Just these sorts of things that really like allow my body to be taken care of. Feels like a really important part of the overall healing. And then also in my sessions, what's really important is always coming back to the body. And if in my sessions with my clients I start losing my way, I always come back to the body, back to my body, back to my client's body, and work from there. Something else that happened is my father died when I was 15, and this was obviously impacted me and my brother hugely. But there was also a stoic thing where my mother said no one should see you cry, and so we had to kind of, you know, we weren't allowed to show emotion around this to others. And so that means that I really didn't deal with his death, or I didn't grieve until I had my sort of spiritual emergence, because I just didn't let those feelings come up. And then suddenly after that happened, I cried. I mean, I feel like I cried for 8 years in various ways. And I think, yeah, feeling grief and feeling the emotions we haven't felt is a really important part of coming back to ourselves. And just also to touch on what Jules said, which I think I noticed both me and Satyin were kind of really nodding with the direct link between the sort of psychosis, the really clean line between psychosis and spiritual emergence, and the fact that that creates another separation from other mental illness. And actually, in my work, I've seen that every mental emotional disorder has a spiritual aspect, or it exists in every dislocation. And so I just really wanted to echo what Jules has said around that. And I realize I'm sort of gone over time a bit, so I'm just going to end by saying that, yeah, I think I've sort of covered all the ways that I've sort of found integration, which is through being, also I didn't mention being creative has been really important for me, and connecting to nature, taking care of my body, and then also my own therapy. So I will leave it there.
Thank you very much, Anna. That was lovely and powerful and wise. So Satyin's going to talk now. If you keep it 15 minutes, just so we leave everybody time for questions, Satyin. So Satyin is a spiritual chaplain at the East London Mental Health Trust, or ELFT it's called, but I'm never quite sure what ELFT stands like, but a big mental health trust in East London. And he's also ordained in the London Triratna Buddhist order. And he wrote us a fantastic chapter about the chaplain. It was called The Chaplain Who Believed He Was Jesus, I think was the title. So he's got a lot of personal and experience in the work he does as well in psychiatric wards. So over to you, Satyin.
Thank you, Jules. So yeah, my background, worked in mental health services 23 years, and East London now includes Bedfordshire as far as mental health is concerned, in occupational therapy and psychology. Also outside of work, 13 years ago I started the London group of the Spiritual Crisis Network, a peer support group to, I think, really appease my conscience of being part of the system. And I'm pleased to say I'm now doing those sorts of peer support groups in the system. So it's nice that there is change, and I think that's certainly my reason for being part of the system, to try and sort of change things from within. And I'm 6 years old today. I was publicly ordained today 6 years ago. So thank you for attending my birthday. Just throw a bit of grandiosity in terms of. And I've also got quite an active link with the mental health system in Uganda. So before all of that, I was an inpatient, age 20. My overall point, really to start with, is that I don't think my experiences are that unusual. What I think is much more unusual is the opportunities I've had to make sense of them, to integrate, to make meaning, and get validation. So I'll also try and say a little bit about that. So yeah, I grew up sort of nominally, a bit more of a nominally Christian. I did choose to do Bible study at school, which wasn't very cool. And I remember praying sincerely for the Holy Spirit to enter my life. So I think, yeah, I can say there was a spiritual yearning at some point, but that was quite quickly dropped, and I didn't have any interest in religion. But at age 20, second year at university, it's kind of classic timing. Some use of cannabis. I announced to my housemates I was Jesus at one point. There was a memorable moment of, after a few interesting noticeable but not worrying changes, but I had a sense of kind of breaking through something, being very begrudgingly allowed through some sort of membrane, and something saying, oh, if you must then, and then just coming out with it and freaking myself out as much as anybody else that I announced I was Jesus. A few days later, after multiple assessments, I was kind of trying to prove telepathy at various points to the university GP and the assessing people. So I'm tucked up in bed, being injected in the bum. Overall, in a way, it was quite interesting. It was quite exciting, a bit hypermania, but it was also terrifying. The night I was admitted, I think I thought I was turning into a female. Perhaps I didn't quite, couldn't quite make sense of where I was fully, although I did sort of know. I had brief experiences of hearing voices. The idea that, I went around to some friends when I'd realised how strange I sounded. I took myself off to some other friends and foolishly smoked more cannabis when it first happened, when I first made this announcement, and then saw the TV there and there's some soap opera on. And I was like, oh yes, see, there's something amazing happening in the world. So there was that kind of ideas of reference from the TV. But I mean, I spent about 2.5 months in hospital. I was very lucky to have a very supportive family, although it was very kind of worrying and scary for them. But and also the ward I was on at that point, it was actually at Bart's Hospital, part of what became East London Trust. It was a pretty good ward, so I was quite lucky in some ways. But I went back to university, learned as inherently you did, to just dismiss it as illness and being broken and kind of forget about that. But I was quite lucky. 6 and 7 years later, I got part funded by my occupational therapy department I was working in to attend some conferences on psychosis and spirituality that Isabel Clarke organised. That some of you may be aware of her work. There's a couple of editions of a book, Psychosis and Spirituality, that arose out of those. And I met others who'd had similar experiences, and professionals who were interested and saw some of my experiences as meaningful. And so I kind of had to accept, actually, maybe what at the time seemed relatively profound, maybe there was something that I did need to kind of take much more seriously. But I was pretty sure that I wouldn't have another experience like that. I'd got into doing yoga regularly, starting to meditate, go on meditation retreats. So I was very confident nothing like that would happen again. But on the 10th anniversary, virtually, I fell in love on a Buddhist retreat, and it sort of psychically ripped me open, I suppose. There was lots of synchronicities. There was this thought I'd met this person before, or perhaps a sense that I knew them already, that was somewhat mutual, and certainly a very strong mutual sense of connection, and a very serious relationship, a marriage that arose out of that. I was quite lucky that the person at the time sort of fell in love, and although I went a bit bonkers, was willing to kind of stay with me, be a little bit patient around that. What I was particularly lucky about was I was able to email Isabel Clarke and her late husband Chris and say, you might remember this guy who in a wobbly voice said he thought he was Jesus at this conference a few years ago. Well, actually, I'm having another spiritual emergency. And I got very respectful, kindly emails back from both of them. They both remembered me, and that validation was crucial. I remember printing it out on an old university printer or somewhere and showing it to my mum and saying, look, this person who's a bit of a UK lead in this area doesn't think I'm completely bonkers, because naturally my parents were a bit worried. And I said, some parallels again. The thoughts are racing. I hadn't had much sleep at the end of the retreat. And then, there was a particular event because the furniture fell over, a few other strange coincidences. And everything just went still, and very kind of expansive state of mind, of consciousness that I was very surprised by. And that lasted for about a week in the main phase of it, although there was a wake of it for many months afterwards. But at that point, I was waking up every day going, oh, it's still here, the ruminative mind having dropped away. And I guess, I'm an interesting case study in the sense of having grown up somewhat Christian and then got into Buddhism. Kind of thought, well, maybe this means I'm enlightened, and certainly told that to my new partner, and that she would be next, which was an interesting conversation. But I was very lucky that I got validation from Isabel and Chris. I knew where I was in my occupational therapy training, the counsellor happened to be trained in psychosynthesis, so I could actually talk to about spiritual emergency. Even one of my lecturers had been to one of those conferences years back, so I was very lucky to be able to get some sensible advice, and crucially, validation, understanding, not pathologizing straight away. That was the 10th anniversary, and then the 20th anniversary was when I actually got ordained. Again, some interesting things happened around that. Again, there was a falling in love, and that time there was an unusual belief that the universe was really doing everything it could to help me. It was kind of the exact opposite of the harmful paranoia that as I travelled across Europe by train to a retreat centre in Spain, there was all sorts of synchronicities, and it was this overwhelming sense of the universe being on my side and wonderful blessings and things happening. So that was kind of an interesting, kind of, again, slightly altered experience. I don't mind the term psychosis as long as I'm allowed to also use the term psycho-spiritual emergency. I will strongly repeat, as Anna has done. I was really pleased to hear Jules say it so strongly. I never thought of it as idea as elitist, but that's exactly right. This differential diagnosis, and I'm even going to pull up the Groff book from the year after, and it's there in the appendix, how you differentiate, differential diagnosis between spiritual emergence and psychiatric disorders. And the only party line when I was centrally involved in the Spiritual Crisis Network in this country, the only thing we kind of had as a sort of standing point was that actually, no, it's not that black and white. My experience was, it was messy. The stuff in my experience when I was on the ward, that I think I announced that smoking's the cure for AIDS, or all sorts of, there's bits where I could just kind of nonsensical forget that, whereas there was actually also relatively profound experience which was formative, which brought about a lot of changes for me, sort of changed my life. So yeah, that's kind of was going to be my central point, which wonderfully Jules had already made, really, that this idea of differentiating between a spiritual emergency, which I could easily do as a nice middle class diagnosis. I actually found I had many years of being called in for a GP, even though I lived in a Buddhist community with a psychiatrist and a junior doctor and a psychology trainee, and I was I was working in psychology then myself. I got called in for mental health reviews every year, and it turned out I had the label of schizophrenia on my notes, which I had no idea. It hadn't come from secondary mental health services. But it's interesting the way terms appear and stick. So yeah, I fully refuse to let go of that title of psychosis. I'm reminded in Uganda, I've got a friend there who, if we use the term "gone case," people get written off, and I think I've sort of promised I'll stop moaning about this and write something about it. But I really think there's a need to do incident report forms in mental health trusts. If you hear a doctor, usually, unfortunately, not so commonly, but still occasionally saying, yes, this severe illness you'll be stuck with for the rest of your life, that is institutional abuse, I think, and there's no evidence to suggest that. I really encourage people to check out Jim Van Os, wonderful Dutch psychiatrist, and his he has this idea of psychosis susceptibility syndrome, rejecting free. I also so in the same way as all these has been said, that the things that can be helpful, the grounding, the processing, the integrating of what gets labelled as spiritual emergency, all stands. If I sit down with someone and sort of introduce the idea of maybe you could see this as a transformation rather than that you're just ill and broken. The Spiritual Crisis Network, we gave it a strap line from breakdown to breakthrough. It's a much more helpful way of being with one's challenges, to see it as perhaps a wake-up call to look at the way we're living our life. So I think in one sense I'm quite an interesting case study to kind of announce both I was Jesus and then announce that I was enlightened, perhaps depending on the context and interests that I had. I'm very interested in people like the Sangoma of Southern Africa, the traditional healers, and some of the concepts such as an illness of calling, this idea that perhaps if experiences are recognised, you might actually be encouraged into the compound and trained up and become a respected figure rather than locked up. That's not to say, it's very easy to romanticize what goes on in India and Africa, and I know a man that was tied to a tree for 4 years in Uganda, so I'm under no illusions about how things can be. My Buddhist teacher talked about hallucinogens as a smash and grab raid on the transcendental, which I think is quite an interesting term. This idea that maybe we might get into different states of consciousness, of mind, but perhaps we're not sufficiently integrated, we don't have sufficient positive emotion to hold the experience, to process it. So Yeah, I think that's most of the things I want to say. I'm reminded there's a really good psychologist, researcher, Charlie Harriet-Maitland, did some research comparing mediums, people from spiritual psychic schools, this sort of thing, and people who are long-term service users. And in a high quality, quite small qualitative study, showed that phenomenologically people had the same sorts of experiences. They reported the same sorts of symptoms. What seemed to differentiate the prognosis of where you went was how you and others around you responded to them. So if you're told, there's a, you've got a problem, if people freak out, are scared, if you get to fear, then it's a much more difficult thing to process, rather than there's I think Ajahn Sumedho, a very experienced meditator, talked about just sitting with all these bizarre experiences, the psychic clutter that comes up, and obviously most of us aren't in that state of development and spiritual maturity to be able to so easily just sit with unusual experience. But I think there's a strong point there in the way we respond, the way the system responds, the way we respond to our friends and family can make the world a difference. So I think that's probably about my time. So I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much as well, Satyin. That was excellent. Thank you. Thanks to both of you. It's weird doing this over Zoom, and I just applaud us for sharing this stuff, sitting in our living rooms on our own, wherever. So I'm going to hand over to Andrew now to do the Q&A or to pick the people.
Brilliant. Actually,
thank you,
David. Yeah, go for it, David.
We'll do it together. Well, thanks to all of you for very thought-provoking both analysis and experience, and how these all fit together and give us more of an insight into our mental, emotional, and spiritual processes. Satyin, just on a light note, I was intrigued by your empty shelves behind me. My shelves are full, as people can see. We're full of books, and I was reminded of a cartoon about birthday card for the Dalai Lama, and he opens a box and there's nothing in it, and he says, "Nothing, just what I've always wanted," which is really charming.